Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk entitled Spatial Language Use Predicts Spatial Memory of Children. Evidence from Sign, Speech, and Speech plus Gesture. While playing with these toys on the floor, children communicate about these toys as well as the spatial relation between them. Communicating and reasoning about spatial relations are among the fundamental abilities that children need to develop. The relationship between encoding spatial relations in language and reasoning about them later on has been the focus of many research. Previous work shows that communicating and reasoning about spatial relations are related to each other, and knowledge and use of spatial terms are the strong predictors of children's spatial reasoning in general and spatial memory in particular. In this study, we investigate this relationship from the perspective of visual spatial modality of encoding. Language is a multimodal phenomenon. In addition to speech, there are co-speech gestures and sign languages that rely on visual spatial modality. These expressions incorporate iconic tools and encode spatial relations differently than speech. For instance, imagine that you are asked to encode the spatial relation between the money box and the straw in this picture. Spoken languages use arbitrary spatial terms, such as left-right to do so. Iconic expressions, on the other hand, allow for visually motivating meaning mappings between the linguistic form and its referent in the real space. This can be in the form of sign. For instance, this little girl is using a linguistic form that is called classifier construction. In this construction, after introducing the lexical sign for these items, she chooses certain hand shapes to represent the size and shape of the objects. For instance, she is using a round hand shape to represent the round nature of the money box and an index finger to indicate the elongated nature of the straw. Moreover, she places these hand shapes on the signing space in an analog way to the real space to indicate the spatial relation between the objects. In spoken languages, co-speech gestures also provide visually motivated information, such as this pointing gesture indicating left gestural space. As can be seen from these examples, iconic expressions encode the spatial relation more directly compared to speech, and iconic forms of communication through sign or co-speech gestures might enhance memory more than arbitrary encodings in speech. In this study, our empirical focus is the spatial encoding and memory of left-right relations between objects. Linguistic encoding of left-right is a late aspect of language development of speaking children. That is, they do not encode left-right until 9 or 10 years of age. Previous research shows that iconic forms of communication facilitate the linguistic development of spatial expressions of left-right relations. The first evidence comes from a study comparing spatial expressions of signing and speaking children. In this study, deaf children using Turkish Sign Language encoded left-right around age 5, although Turkish-speaking children in the same study encoded left-right around age 8. Earlier encoding of left-right by signing children compared to speaking children is attributed to the iconic linguistic forms to encode spatial relations in sign. The second evidence shows that the facilitating effect of iconic forms are also present for gestures. For instance, Turkish-speaking children rarely use left-right spatial terms in their speech and instead use general spatial nouns, such as side, around age 8. The use of side does not give the exact spatial relation between the objects, rather only give a relational information. However, children have been found to use spatial co-speech gestures together with side to encode the exact spatial relation iconically. Taken together, if iconic forms of communication provides earlier encoding of left-right, they might also provide new evidence and unique insights into the relationship between spatial language and cognition. Let's first focus on encoding with speech and its relations to cognition. Previous work investigating the relation between encoding with spatial terms and spatial memory accuracy shows that using spatial terms such as left, right, next, and middle helps children perform better in spatial tasks. One study experimentally showed that Providing children with spatial terms before the experiment increased their spatial memory, both tested immediately and after a 2-day delay, compared to children who did not receive any spatial terms. However, this study lacks evidence as to whether the use of spatial terms by children themselves relates to their spatial memory accuracy. Moreover, all of these studies focused exclusively on speech and underrepresented spoken languages by neglecting co-speech gestures and totally disregarded sign languages. One prior study investigating memory for spatial relations with deaf children who were not exposed to language input found that these children do not use spatial gestures indicating locations of objects, and they lag behind hearing children in their memory for locations. The results show how important it is to have a language system to encode spatial relations performed in a spatial task. Few other studies attempted to include gestures to investigate the relationship between spatial language and spatial memory. In these studies, using gesture alone is compared to using speech alone to solve the task. These comparisons revealed contrasting findings showing that use of gestures promotes either better or worse memory accuracy compared to speech. However, the task used in these studies requires children to select a reference frame to perform the task, and selecting a reference frame requires remembering locations of objects relative to one's own body or distal environmental cues, and this process is relatively difficult for children. Moreover, to our knowledge, no study so far focused on spoken languages by incorporating speech-gesture combinations, and no study so far compared sign and spoken languages. In fact, visual spatial languages may reveal important insights due to different acquisition trajectories. In the present study, we investigate whether encoding a spatial relation in a picture description predicts later recognition memory accuracy for signing and speaking children. Besides, we investigate whether differences in the modality of encoding lead to differences in recognition memory accuracy. We tested 2 groups of children, deaf signers of Turkish Sign Language and hearing speakers of Turkish. All deaf children acquired their language from birth by their deaf parents. Participants first engaged in a description task. In this task, they were asked to describe the pictures of 2 objects in various spatial configurations to a confederate addressee. Addressee has a tablet with the displays and makes a selection based on participants' description. In each display, there were 4 pictures, and every picture had the same 2 objects but in a different spatial relationship. Within one display, target picture to be described to the addressee was pointed by an arrow. After the description task is completed, participants were engaged in a distractor and later a surprise recognition memory task. In the recognition memory task, they received same displays without the arrow, and the display order and the arrangement of the 4 pictures in one display were randomized. Participants were asked to select the target picture that they had described during the description task by using the mouse. We coded participants' descriptions in speech gesture combinations, and in sign. Let's look at speech. In speech, there were 2 ways of encoding the spatial relation. One way was using left-right spatial nouns, and the other one was using a general noun side. Participants also used speech and gestures together in their descriptions. We coded these descriptions as speech plus gesture. In some other descriptions, participants did not provide a spatial relation between the objects and only identified the objects by naming them, such as there is a cup and there is a pen. We coded these descriptions as no spatial encoding. For sign descriptions, signers used 5 different linguistic strategies to describe the spatial relation between objects. The most frequent of those strategies was the classifier constructions, as I described above in more detail. Descriptions with no spatial encoding in sign, similar to speech, include descriptions with missing spatial relation. Following previous research, we expect descriptions that encode spatial relation to have higher memory accuracy than descriptions that do not encode spatial relation, and we expect this regardless of the language of the participant. When the modality of encoding is concerned, we have two comparisons. In comparing sign to speech alone, we expected descriptions in sign to predict better memory accuracy than speech alone descriptions due to iconicity of the linguistic encoding representing the spatial relation more directly. In comparing sign to speech plus gesture, we foresee two possibilities. Descriptions in sign and speech plus gesture might generate equal memory accuracy. This might be because taking gestures into account might better represent spoken languages by incorporating iconic forms. Alternatively, signers might outperform speakers even when their gestures are taken into account due to conventional and obligatory ways to encode space in sign, but not in co-speech gesture. Before moving on to presenting memory results, let me give you percentages of the distribution of these encodings across the groups and modalities within the data. Signing children encoded the spatial relation between items in 90% of their total descriptions. Speaking children encoded the spatial relation between the items in 96% of their descriptions, considering both speech and speech gesture combinations. In modality comparisons, sign descriptions always include all of the descriptions in sign, which is 90% of the total descriptions. Speech alone descriptions represent a subset of data, and speech plus gesture descriptions represent another subset of spoken language data. Let's look at memory results. We analyzed whether having encoding the spatial relation between the items or not related to recognition memory of accuracy of signers and speakers differently. Indeed, we found an effect of spatial encoding regardless of the language group of the participant. Next, we moved on to modality comparisons. To do so, we looked at a subset of memory items which were encoded by sign or speech alone. Results show that encoding the spatial relation with different modalities does not predict statistically significant differences in memory accuracy. Finally, we analyzed another subset, that is, memory accuracy of the items that were encoded by sign or speech plus gesture. Results show that, again, encoding the spatial relation with different modalities does not predict statistically significant differences in memory accuracy. Let's summarize our findings. First, we investigated whether encoding with spatial language predicts better memory than not encoding with spatial language. Indeed, we found that encoding with language predicted better memory. Second, we investigated whether encoding with different modalities lead to differences in memory accuracy. We found that modality of encoding does not further predict differences in memory accuracy. So, what do these results suggest to us? Our findings provide further support to the literature showing that encoding with language promotes better memory and extends this to encoding with sign and speech plus gesture. However, encoding with different modalities did not further modulate spatial memory. Even though iconic forms facilitate the development of spatial language, they do not further modulate the relation between spatial language and memory. When interpreting our null results across modality comparisons, it is important to consider the nature of our task structure. First of all, previous studies comparing encoding with speech alone or gesture alone on spatial task performance used more difficult tasks than that are used in our recognition memory task. Second, it's also possible that not imposing participants to respond quickly in the memory task might have diminished the differences in memory accuracy, where participants might have took their time to find the correct answer. In conclusion, the present study contributes further evidence to the link between the use of spatial language and later memory accuracy of children. That is, encoding with language promotes better memory than not encoding a spatial relation by children themselves. However, the modality of encoding via sign, speech, or speech plus gesture does not further modulate differences in memory accuracy of children. First of all, I want to thank you for listening on behalf of my co-authors as well. Next, I want to thank all deaf participants and families and all deaf and hearing assistants. This study would not be possible without their efforts.